When the avoidant realizes they can't stop thinking about you, it's not because they've suddenly developed a new depth of emotion, it's because the emotional weight they've suppressed finally breaks through the defenses they've so carefully constructed. See, this is where we misunderstand the avoidant dynamic. We believe that silence is indifference. We think that emotional distance means they've moved on, but that's rarely the truth. The avoidant is not emotionally absent, they are emotionally overwhelmed and unskilled at tolerating closeness without feeling threatened. Avoidant detachment is often misinterpreted as coldness or emotional vacancy. On the surface, it appears as if the avoidant person simply doesn't care, that they're indifferent to connection, uninterested in vulnerability, and immune to emotional closeness. But this is a dangerous illusion, and one that distorts the very core of what avoidant attachment truly is. At its root, avoidant detachment is not a lack of feeling, it's a defense mechanism carefully developed over time to protect against the overwhelming fear of emotional engulfment, abandonment, or dependency. In developmental psychology, avoidant attachment typically forms in early childhood when a caregiver consistently fails to respond to the child's emotional needs. The child learns, often unconsciously, that expressing vulnerability results in rejection, discomfort, or punishment. So, in order to preserve some sense of emotional safety and self-regulation, the child suppresses their natural instinct to seek closeness. They internalize the belief that they must rely solely on themselves, that intimacy equals danger, and that emotional needs are a source of shame. This survival response becomes a deeply ingrained blueprint that persists into adulthood, shaping how they approach relationships. So, what looks like apathy is actually hypervigilance. The avoidant is constantly monitoring for threats to their independence, autonomy, and emotional control. Emotional intimacy feels intrusive, even if it's well-intentioned. Connection feels like a trap. And yet, paradoxically, they still long for love, for partnership, for connection. They just don't know how to tolerate the vulnerability that comes with it. That is the central paradox of the avoidant. They desire closeness, but are terrified by it. Avoidant attachment then becomes their armor. It's not that they don't feel deeply. They often feel so much that they've learned to numb it out before it even reaches the surface. The detachment isn't born of emotional absence, but of emotional overwhelm. Their emotional depth is hidden beneath layers of rationalization, minimization, and emotional suppression. They protect their inner world by pushing others away, not because they're incapable of love, but because love feels inherently unsafe. And this is why pushing an avoidant for more connection usually backfires. They interpret pressure as a threat, not a gesture of care. They retreat further, not because they don't feel something, but because feeling something makes them vulnerable, and vulnerability is what they fear most. Their detachment is a signal that they are emotionally flooded, not empty. Understanding this transforms the narrative. The avoidant silence, their emotional distance, their refusal to engage in depth, it's not a sign of deficiency, it's a sign of protection. They are not unreachable, but they are defended. And if we stop mistaking that defense for indifference, we can begin to see avoidant individuals not as emotionally absent, but as emotionally armored. And like all armor, it wasn't built to keep people out forever, it was built to survive what they believed they couldn't endure. The human mind is a remarkable mechanism, designed not just to store memories but to process, interpret, and often reframe them, especially the emotionally significant ones. When a relationship ends or a meaningful connection dissolves, particularly under emotionally intense or unresolved conditions, the mind tends to revisit those moments repeatedly. This phenomenon becomes even more profound in individuals with avoidant attachment patterns. The avoidant does not simply walk away and forget, they retreat while the mind loops over what they couldn't fully confront in real time. In essence, the mind replays what the heart was too afraid to experience fully. Avoidantly attached individuals often suppress or shut down emotional responses in the moment. When intimacy becomes too overwhelming, when it threatens their sense of independence or evokes childhood experiences of conditional love, they detach, disengage, or intellectualize the situation. They leave not because they don't feel, but because they can't afford to feel in the moment. Vulnerability is perceived as weakness, emotional closeness as a threat. And so, the full weight of an emotional experience is rarely processed in real time. It's postponed, deferred, and often buried beneath a rational facade. But emotions don't vanish just because they're ignored. The human psyche doesn't delete feelings, it archives them. And what remains unprocessed becomes a subject of rumination. The mind returns to those moments of vulnerability, tenderness, or loss, like a looping reel. It replays conversations. It reimagines expressions. It analyzes tone, pauses, and meanings between words. But why? Because the emotional system demands resolution. The mind is doing the work the heart wasn't allowed to do. This is particularly evident after a breakup or prolonged separation. An avoidant may appear composed, even relieved at first. But as space and silence grow, and the threat of enmeshment disappears, the unresolved emotional content starts surfacing. Safe from immediate vulnerability, their unconscious mind reactivates the very moments they once suppressed. They start to remember the kindness, the safety, the connection, not because they suddenly miss you in a linear way, but because their system is trying to retroactively process what it couldn't before. That replaying, however, is not necessarily healing. It can become a cycle. It's the psyche's attempt to make sense of what the heart avoided. Sometimes it results in regret, sometimes in longing, often in confusion. The avoidant may not even understand why they can't stop thinking about you. They may think they've moved on, that they made the rational choice. But the mind brings back what the heart left incomplete. Understanding this offers a more compassionate lens through which to view emotional detachment. It reveals that what seems like coldness is often fear. What seems like disinterest is often unresolved connection. The mind's relentless return to a person or moment is not a flaw, it's an echo. An echo of the emotional truth that was too overwhelming to fully live out when it mattered most. And in that echo lies both their suffering and their unspoken attachment. Time and space are often mistaken as tools of emotional erasure. People believe that if you're away from someone long enough, or if you create enough distance, the feelings will fade, the memories will dull, and the bond will dissolve. But human connection doesn't operate on such mechanical terms. Especially when emotions run deep, and conversations are left unfinished, space doesn't dissolve connection. Rather, it sharpens what remains unresolved. Space doesn't erase connection. It intensifies unresolved bonds. When a relationship ends or contact is cut, what truly begins is not detachment but reflection. The mind is not a blank slate, it is a narrative-seeking machine. And when there is emotional distance without emotional closure, the story doesn't conclude. It amplifies. We begin to fill the silence with meaning. We imagine what the other person might be thinking, feeling, doing. We question what could have been different. The emotional system doesn't simply discard unfinished attachment. It loops through it, seeking resolution. And the more silent the space, the louder that unresolved bond becomes in the mind. This is especially true in relationships touched by anxious or avoidant dynamics. For the avoidant, space initially feels like safety. It's a relief from emotional pressure, a return to autonomy, to psychological breathing room. But as time stretches on, the absence they've created becomes an echo chamber. The person they pushed away doesn't vanish from their consciousness. In fact, that person often becomes more vivid, because now the fear of engulfment has subsided, and what's left is the unprocessed emotion they never let themselves fully feel. The space becomes a mirror, forcing them to confront the discomfort they fled from. Likewise, for someone with anxious tendencies, space doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like abandonment. But over time, something shifts. The absence creates clarity. The intensity of their longing might lessen, but the questions persist. The unresolved dynamic still has an emotional gravity, pulling thoughts back to the bond, even if they don't act on it, because the emotions that were never validated or understood are still alive in the body. What makes space intensify connection isn't just emotional longing, it's cognitive engagement. It's the act of mentally returning to what wasn't healed, what wasn't said, what wasn't fully lived. The mind becomes the battleground for closure that was never given. Even if contact is never resumed, the connection continues to exist in the psychological realm, replayed, reframed, reanalyzed. This is why no contact is not about forgetting, it's about understanding. It's not about pretending the bond didn't exist. It's about using the space to reclaim clarity, not fantasy. Space, when respected, can bring peace, but when used to avoid emotional truth, it only intensifies what lingers. So while people may drift apart physically, what remains psychologically can become even more potent. And that is the paradox. Distance doesn't kill connection, it reveals its depth, its incompletion, and sometimes its enduring hold on the psyche. When emotional closeness becomes threatening, when the act of opening up feels like surrendering control, many people, especially those with avoidant tendencies, retreat. But the retreat doesn't end the emotional process, it merely shifts it from external expression to internal processing. Instead of having vulnerable conversations or seeking understanding in the presence of another, the avoidant mind turns inward. The vulnerability is still there, but it's buried under a layer of protection, and in that protected state, rumination becomes the substitute for authentic contact. Rumination replaces contact when vulnerability feels unsafe. This internal replay mechanism is not random. It serves a psychological purpose. For someone who cannot tolerate the unpredictability of emotional exposure, who fears being overwhelmed, engulfed, or dependent, rumination offers control. You can revisit a conversation 1,000 times in your head, without ever having to risk rejection. You can analyze every word, every glance, and every silence, without making yourself vulnerable to someone else's response. It is a simulation of emotional engagement that avoids the perceived dangers of actual emotional intimacy. However, this simulation comes at a cost. While it may feel safer, rumination is not resolution. It traps the individual in an emotional feedback loop, thinking, questioning, regretting, and reimagining, without ever arriving at peace. The longer vulnerability is avoided, the more intense the rumination becomes. And yet the avoidant person often doesn't recognize this as emotional suffering. They experience it as anxiety, restlessness, or unexplained sadness. They believe they've moved on, but their mind continues circling back to the relationship, to the person, to the bond they were never quite able to face fully. In many cases, this rumination can last far longer than the relationship itself. That's because the mind is trying to process emotions that were never consciously acknowledged. The avoidant person may not have allowed themselves to feel grief, fear, or longing at the time, so those emotions don't disappear, they wait. And when silence replaces connection, they come forward. But instead of being felt and expressed, they get rerouted through mental analysis, through endless inner dialogue, through hypothetical scenarios. This is the mind's attempt to work through what the heart was not allowed to experience directly. It's important to note that this isn't exclusive to avoidance. Anyone who feels unsafe being emotionally vulnerable may fall into this cycle. But for those whose primary coping mechanism is detachment, the irony is stark. In trying to avoid emotional dependency, they end up mentally tethered to the very bond they were running from. Rumination becomes their substitute for connection, not because they don't care, but because they don't feel safe caring openly. Understanding this dynamic changes how we interpret silence. Silence is not always indifference. Sometimes it's a battleground between suppressed emotion and self-protection. Rumination is not always overthinking. Sometimes it's the mind's desperate attempt to process what the heart didn't know how to hold. And until vulnerability feels safe, the loop will continue, quietly, obsessively, and in isolation. Avoidants are often misunderstood as people who don't feel deeply. But this couldn't be further from the truth. They are not emotionally barren. They're emotionally overwhelmed beneath the surface. What they struggle with is not emotion itself, but emotional dissonance, the inner conflict that arises when their emotional experiences contradict their core psychological defenses. Avoidants struggle to regulate emotional dissonance, not feelings. Emotional dissonance is the tension that occurs when the heart and the mind are in opposition. For avoidantly attached individuals, the internal narrative often sounds like this: I want connection, but I don't trust it. I miss you, but closeness threatens me. I feel something strong, but I don't know how to handle it without losing myself. This conflict is not a lack of care. It is a collision between desire and defense, and that's where the true difficulty lies. Avoidants often grow up in environments where emotional needs were neglected, dismissed, or seen as weaknesses. They learn to associate closeness with loss of autonomy, or the risk of being engulfed. As a result, they adapt by numbing, distancing, and controlling. But when someone comes along who stirs genuine emotional attachment, especially in romantic relationships, that strategy starts to crack. Emotions arise despite their defenses, and it creates inner chaos. This isn't emotional absence, it's emotional confusion. What makes this dissonance so hard to regulate is that avoidants are often unaware of the contradiction playing out within them. On the surface, they appear composed or detached, but inside, there is a battle between their longing for connection and their fear of it. They feel affection, love, jealousy, even grief, but they don't know how to integrate those feelings with their belief that closeness is unsafe. So they suppress, rationalize, or shut down. This doesn't eliminate the feeling, it just buries it under layers of cognitive dissonance. And here's where things get complicated. The more the avoidance suppresses, the stronger the emotional charge becomes. Their inability to resolve the dissonance often leads to emotional outbursts, abrupt distancing, or complete withdrawal, not because they don't feel, but because they don't know how to coexist with what they feel. Emotions become threatening, not for their content, but for the implications. If I feel this much, it means I care. If I care, I could be hurt. If I'm hurt, I lose control. That's the loop they live in. To heal this pattern, avoidants don't need to feel more. They need to learn how to tolerate the discomfort of emotional contradiction. They need to recognize that feelings aren't betrayals of independence, but expressions of humanity. The goal isn't to eliminate their instinct for self-protection, but to help them realize that connection doesn't require the loss of self. True emotional regulation doesn't mean avoiding emotion, it means allowing space for dissonance, without collapsing into it. Understanding this changes how we approach the avoidant. They are not emotionally incapable, they are emotionally conflicted, and until they learn to reconcile that internal division, their struggle will not be with love itself, but with the fear of what love seems to demand. The inability to forget is often the first crack in their emotional armor. For the avoidantly attached individual, the entire architecture of their emotional world is designed to keep vulnerability at bay. They've built walls, not because they don't care, but because caring feels dangerous, entangling, overwhelming, and unpredictable. Emotional distance is their safe zone. Detachment is their control. But memory is uncontrollable. What they often underestimate is how deeply the mind retains what the heart was too guarded to express. An avoidant may end a relationship and appear indifferent. They may go silent, withdraw, avoid closure, but the absence of outward emotion doesn't mean the experience disappears. It simply goes underground, compressed into memory, folded into the subconscious, and stored in places they don't yet know how to access. Over time, these memories don't fade, they echo, and eventually one resurfaces. A phrase you used, the look in your eyes, the comfort of being understood, without performance. That's when it begins to crack. This moment, this inability to forget, is not a matter of sentimentality. It's neurological and psychological. Emotional experiences leave imprints. The brain encodes emotionally salient events more vividly than mundane ones, especially when those events contradict a person's internal model of safety and love. For the avoidant, a meaningful connection violates their expectation that closeness must always lead to loss of self. So ironically, it becomes unforgettable. What follows is confusion. They don't understand why they keep replaying something they believe they've buried. They assume distance should equal detachment, but their mind, free from the immediate pressure of vulnerability, begins to process what their heart could not. They start to feel the loss, not because they want to, but because their defense system is no longer being actively triggered. And in that quiet, memories resurface like ghosts, asking to be acknowledged. But memory in this case doesn't bring clarity, it brings emotional dissonance. Suddenly they're haunted by something they believe they were safe from. And because avoidants don't naturally seek comfort through emotional expression, they keep this conflict to themselves. They isolate, they analyze, they wonder why your face won't leave their mind, why certain words echo in moments of silence, why they feel your absence more acutely now than when they were with you. They don't chase, but internally, something collapses. This internal collapse is not the same as conscious regret. It's not yet a clear longing. It's an erosion of the certainty they once had. It's the creeping realization that emotional distance is not immunity. The heart, no matter how protected, still knows what it has lost. And the mind, once it can no longer forget, becomes the first place where healing or reckoning, can begin. Because in the end, it is not contact that brings an avoidant to confrontation. It is memory. And when memory lingers, uninvited and unshakable, it signals that something inside them has been impacted beyond their control. That's the beginning of change. Not visible yet, but inevitable.